There is a photograph taken the morning after Pickett's charge. The field between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge, nearly a mile of open Pennsylvania farmland, is covered in small, dark shapes. Hundreds of them, thousands. They are men, or they were. On July 3, 1863, approximately 12,500 Confederate soldiers walked across that field. Not ran, walked, in formation, shoulder to shoulder, at roughly 90 steps per minute, calm as a Sunday procession. They had 15 minutes to cross before reaching the Union rifles waiting on the ridge. By the time it was over, more than half would not walk back out. The question history keeps returning to is deceptively simple. Why didn't they run? The answer reaches into the architecture of military obedience, the psychology of collective fear, and the hard limits of what any institution can change about itself in the middle of a catastrophe. And it reaches finally into the most uncomfortable question of all: what men will sacrifice themselves for, and whether the people who send them forward have any right to ask. Be sure to like and subscribe to the channel as we continue. To understand why Civil War soldiers walked in lines into rifle fire, you first have to understand what walking in formation was designed to solve. For over a century, Western armies had perfected linear tactics. Men armed with smoothbore muskets, accurate to maybe 50 yards on a good day, were massed into dense horizontal lines and ordered to fire simultaneously. One soldier shooting alone was nearly useless. 100 men firing in a coordinated volley could stop a cavalry charge and decide an afternoon's work in 20 minutes. The math was impeccable. But the formation served another purpose the manuals rarely stated plainly. In a line, a man could not easily run. His officer could see him. His comrades could see him. The formation enforced collective behavior not just through discipline, but through something closer to social gravity. The group moved, and you moved with it, because stopping felt more terrifying than continuing. This was not a flaw in the system, it was the system. When America went to war with itself in 1861, both sides inherited this engine essentially intact. What neither side could account for, and what both armies would spend 4 years discovering the hard way, was the rifle. The Minie ball was one of the most consequential and most catastrophically underestimated pieces of military technology ever introduced. Before its development in the 1840s, rifled muskets were more accurate than smoothbores, but far too slow for battlefield use. The Minie ball changed everything. Its hollow base expanded on firing, gripping the rifling and stabilizing the bullet while loading at nearly smoothbore speed. A standard infantryman could now reliably hit a man-sized target at 300 yards. A practiced marksman could push that to 500. Against a smoothbore accurate to 50 yards, this wasn't an incremental improvement. It was a different category of weapon entirely. By 1861, both armies were equipping their infantry almost entirely with rifled muskets. The tactics built around short-range smoothbores should have been gone too. They were not. And the gap between the rifle's reach and the tactics being used against it would cost somewhere between 600,000 and 850,000 American lives. The failure wasn't stupidity. Training an army of volunteers takes time. The Union and Confederate forces of 1861 were lawyers and farmers and clerks who'd picked up a musket weeks before. Teaching them to fire organized volleys and advance in a dressed line was already a significant achievement. Teaching them the dispersed, individually aimed, initiative-dependent tactics the rifle now demanded, that was beyond the reach of either army in the war's early years. So commanders worked with what they had. Private Sam Watkins of the 1st Tennessee fought in nearly every major engagement of the Western theater. He survived and wrote about it afterward, one of the most honest accounts of what it actually felt like to be an ordinary soldier in those years. At Chickamauga in September 1863, Watkins marched his regiment through dense forest into a Union line. Men around him were struck and fell. The noise, he wrote, was beyond description, a continuous tearing sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And yet he kept moving, not because he wasn't afraid, he was terrified. But the men to his left and right were moving, and something in the geometry of the formation made stopping feel less possible than continuing. You feel like you are part of something bigger, and to stop is to betray it all. This is the dimension of linear tactics, no manual captures, the way the formation colonized the individual soldier's sense of what was possible. To break from the line was not simply to disobey an order, it was to become a different kind of person, alone, exposed, the one man moving against the current of 1,000 others. On December 13, 1862, Union General Ambrose Burnside ordered 14 successive waves of infantry up a gentle slope outside Fredericksburg toward a Confederate line behind a stone wall. The Confederates had elevation, cover, and 400 yards of open ground. The Union soldiers had their orders and each other. None of the 14 assaults came close. More than 12,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded that day. Confederate casualties numbered in the hundreds. Burnside knew, or should have known, exactly what the terrain meant. His subordinate commanders told him. Several begged him not to. He ordered it anyway, not because he failed to understand the math, but because the logic of Civil War command demanded decisive action, and the only decisive action he could conceive of was the frontal assault. This is the distinction the history of this war keeps struggling to hold. The difference between men who made catastrophic decisions and men who were trapped inside systems that produced catastrophic decisions. Both things were true, often in the same person, on the same afternoon. By the spring of 1864, the armies had changed. The men facing each other across the Overland Campaign had been in this war for 3 years. They had learned, at incalculable cost, exactly what the rifle did to men in open formation. They could read a field the way a farmer reads weather. On June 3, 1864, Ulysses Grant ordered a dawn assault on entrenched Confederate positions at Cold Harbor. The attack was broken within the first hour. Approximately 7,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded before the sun had fully risen. Grant later wrote, in his memoirs, composed while dying of throat cancer, that Cold Harbor was the one order he most regretted giving in the entire war. But the detail that stays with you long after the casualty figures blur into abstraction is what the soldiers did the night before. Knowing what morning would bring, the men who were to make the assault took slips of paper and wrote their names and home addresses on them. Then they pinned those slips to the inside of their coats, so their bodies could be identified when recovered, so someone would know where to send word. These were not men without understanding. They knew exactly what was about to happen. They had been in this war long enough to have no illusions left, and they went anyway. Not because they believed they would survive, but because they believed in something larger than survival. For some that was the Union, the end of slavery, the proposition that a nation built on human dignity could not be allowed to fracture. For others it was simpler and older than ideology, the regiment, the company, the particular men beside them who would have to go without them if they stayed back. The Civil War ended in April 1865. The tactics that had devoured so many lives did not end with it. World War I, half a century later, would replay the same catastrophe at industrial scale. Men walking in lines across open ground toward weapons that had, again, outpaced the imagination of the officers directing them. The lesson, apparently, is not one that stays learned. The men who walked into those fields were not simply victims of bad strategy. They were people, making choices, constrained, coerced choices, shaped by everything around them, but choices nonetheless. Understanding why they made them is not the same as endorsing what was asked of them. The two things can be true at once, that their courage was real and that it was wasted, that the tactics were a failure, and that the men carrying them out were not. Pickett's men walked a mile across open farmland and were cut apart by weapons their commanders had refused to fully reckon with. They did it because their comrades were moving. Many of them did it for a cause that history has rightly judged to be wrong. But they were still afraid, and they still walked. That is the thing about courage. It does not require a just cause to be real, and it does not require survival to matter.